inform you about the instructions we followed. Please turn off your video and audio during the session. A small note to our speaker that the talk will be of 12 minutes and the Q&A session will be conducted over an extended 3 minutes after the talk. We are requested and I hope that we can maintain the time during the session. To our audience, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat box. We shall address all the questions in the Q&A session after the talk is over. This session will be chaired by Shamrat Roy, so I request Shamradda to take over the session. Over to you, Shamradda.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
A warm welcome to all of you to the Astrophysics and High Energy Symposium session. So, as Rishabh already picked up, the speaker will be allotted 12 minutes, and I request everyone to, if they have any questions, they may raise their hands and put the questions in the chat box. We will answer it after the talk is over. So, the first speaker in this session today is Pradyumna from Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. I would request Pradyumna to share his screen and go ahead. Pradyumna? Yeah.
My screen visible?
It is yeah, it's visible. You can just present mode, put in the present mode. Yeah. Yeah, it's all right. You go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I will be talking about the radial acceleration relation in galaxy clusters. We know that several mass discrepancies exist in our universe. One of the most famous example is that of the rotation curves. So from what we observe, that is the luminous matter in galaxies, we expect the rotation curve, which is basically the velocity profile, velocity versus radius. What we expect is this dashed line, but what we actually see from measurements, direct measurements of velocity, is that we get this profile. So this led to a prediction of dark matter, and I hope several of I hope many of us know this. So similarly, galaxy clusters also exhibit mass discrepancies, which are observed because of just like how we have a different velocity here, there we observe a different temperature than what we expect. So the galaxy clusters also exhibit mass discrepancies. And now coming to RAR, what is the radial acceleration relation? To keep it very simple, we calculate the radial acceleration, that is v squared over r on this curve, and that is the baryonic acceleration. Baryon, at least within astrophysics, is something that we can observe, that is the luminous matter. And the total acceleration or the observed acceleration is v squared over r on this curve. So basically, Stacy Mega and others in 2016, they tried to plot this observed acceleration versus the baryonic acceleration in log space. And when they fit this relation, what they observe is a very low scatter with a naught as 1.2 times 10 power minus 10 meter per second squared. The low scatter is the surprising point here, the surprising part here. And this relation might be looking very random, but this actually has a base in something known as MOND, which is the modified Newtonian dynamics, which was proposed by Milgrom to explain these rotation curves. And this relation actually can be broken down into two regimes. First is when this baryonic acceleration is very low as compared to a naught. We can actually manipulate this to get the observed acceleration to be square root of the product of a naught and baryonic acceleration. And when we look at this in log space, we should observe a slope of 0.5 when we plot the observed and the baryonic accelerations in log space. And when this baryonic acceleration is very large, we see that this relation actually is boils down to observed acceleration being equal to the baryonic acceleration. So now coming to the question whether this relation can be explained in the famous lambda CDM and MOND. So within lambda CDM, there is actually no simple reason why the baryonic mass, which is actually a very which forms a very small part of the total mass, uh, should be controlling the dark matter, which is actually the major part of the mass budget. Uh, and but still there is a relation. So within lambda CDM, there is no simple reason. However, it could be explained by involving baryonic feedbacks. And for further details, I request everyone to look at the paper on RAR by Professor Paranjapya and Sheth in 2021. Um, Within the MOND paradigm, that is the modified Newtonian dynamics, this is actually a direct consequence, at least in galaxies. Uh, in fact, this relation itself comes from MOND. And the thing here is the MOND actually is known to not work for galaxy clusters. So we would like to test whether RAR still exists in galaxy clusters, whether the scatter is comparable, or whether the best fit parameters are still the same or not. And there have been two previous observations of RAR in clusters. One is that of Dr. Young, Tian, and others. And they observe an acceleration scale, which is about 10 times that of what has been observed for galaxies. However, the scatter is still low. It is about 0.11 dex. For galaxies, it was 0.13 dex. And there was another analysis by Shandel, Popolo, and others. And this also predicted an A naught about 10 times that of galaxies. The scatter that they obtain is actually high, 0.18 dex, but we actually redid this analysis by adding stellar mass to these, and actually we saw that the scatter comes down. So now coming to our analysis, we try to look at three samples of galaxy clusters, and we try to extract RAR in those. So I'll briefly describe the method. The X-ray telescopes give the X-ray images, and from there we get different profiles of temperature, density, etc. And from there we assume hydrostatic equilibrium. This is an important assumption, and from that we get the total mass profiles. And from the density profile, we end up getting the gas mass profile. Gas in the galaxy clusters is known as the intra-cluster medium, which which is actually the major part of the baryons. And the stellar mass is obtained from some empirical relations. And from that, we have the total mass and the baryonic mass profiles. And again, using the Newtonian formula for the centripetal acceleration, we end up getting the total acceleration and baryonic acceleration. Once we have these accelerations, we can fit a straight line using Monte Carlo methods. This is the likelihood that we assume, and we assume flat flyers. And to obtain this acceleration scale, we fix the slope to 0.5, because when in the low acceleration regime, that is when the baryonic acceleration is very low as compared to A naught, we expect it to have a slope of 0.5 in log space. And then the intercept can be linked to A naught. So the first sample that we look at is the Viklin and Chandra sample. This is based on Chandra and Rosat observations. There are 12 clusters in this sample, and we obtain a slope of 0.77, and the scatter is 0.14 dex. However, the error bars are very large here, so nothing conclusive can be said about this sample. However, even for this sample, we obtain an A naught value about 10 times that of the galaxies. The second sample is the XCOP sample, which is based on XMM Newton and SZ observations. So for this profile, actually, we see a very low scatter of 0.11 dex. And the slope here is, however, 1.09, which is not what we expect. We expect it to be 0.5. However, this sample is clearly following radial acceleration relation. So there is a relation which is being followed. However, again, here the A0 value that we obtain is again 10 times that of galaxies, roughly 10 times that of galaxies. Uh, the third sample that we looked at is the Giles Chandra sample, which was again based on Chandra and Rosat observations. Again, for this sample also, we obtain a very low scatter. We obtain a scatter of 0.08 dex. Again, the slope here is 1, which is not what we exactly expect. And the A0 value again here is about 10 times that of galaxies. Um, for this sample, we only choose the relaxed cool core clusters. When we included the relaxed non-cool core clusters, we actually observe that the scatter slightly increases. However, it is still low. So this sample also follows an RAR. So this is the table which compares the best fit parameters obtained for different cluster samples. Clearly, the best fit parameters are not consistent within themselves, and also the A0 values are not exactly consistent within themselves, but all of them roughly point to an acceleration scale which is about 10 times that of galaxies. Looking at the scatter, some of them have very low scatter, so at least some samples are clearly following an area. So here are our conclusions. Firstly, the scatter of some clusters are very low, so we say that at least some of the clusters follow an RAR. But however, since the best fit parameters are not really close to that of the galaxies, we tell that the form of this RAR is different in galaxies and clusters. And the A0 value obtained here is about 10 times that of galaxies. And we actually note that this could be explained by Professor Paranjap and Shades analysis. And also, even within galaxy clusters, these values, these best fit parameters are discrepant by about 5 sigma. So this RAR is not clearly universal law, and it is actually possible that this is an emergent effect that comes up when we stack data. And so this MOND that could easily explain this relation in galaxies, it is clearly not enough to explain RAR in clusters because of the A0 values being different. Within MOND, the A0 is assumed to be a constant, just like gravitational universal gravitational constant G. So this A0 is different, and uh, so however, some of the clusters are clearly following an RAR, that is, the scatter is very low. So any theory which is proposed should be able to explain this. So other way around, we can actually use this to test different theories which are proposed. I would like to thank my professor Shantanu Desai for giving me an opportunity to work on this project. And I also would like to thank the organizers. Thank you. These are the major differences.
So thank you, Pradyumna, for the very nice talk. So there is some questions in the chat box. I am reading it one by one.
Okay.
That's Mrinmoy Ghosh asks that you have said the best fit parameters of this sample agree with the Shan Popolo et al. Analysis on the diffuse CGS DCS sample to within 1 sigma. My question is that is it possible in any way to reduce this error?
Okay. Reduce this error as in no. Okay. Let me just go back to that slide again. What I mean here is the best fit parameters obtained for the Chandel-Popolo and the high flow GCS sample are consistent within 1 sigma. We cannot reduce this. This is not an error. Uh, this is the discrepancy that is between these two samples. I don't think this is an error.
Okay.
This is an observational thing. I cannot.
Okay.
I don't think this can be reduced.
Okay, there is another question from Tanmoy Kole. So there was a slide where you have considered two cases where the baryonic acceleration is much less than or much greater than A0. What would be the case if they were of the same order?
Okay, so when they are of the same order, let me go back to this. So, so this is the case when the acceleration is very low. It's a straight line. And when the acceleration is very high, here it is a slope of 0.5. And when the acceleration is very high, it is a line of slope 1. In between, it is a transition state. However, for galaxy clusters, the accelerations are expected to be very, very low. Very low as compared to the A0, which is of galaxies. That is why
Pradyum, Tanmoy writes in the chat that he meant the next slide.
yes. Yeah.
Okay,
When they are of the same order, they would be somewhere in between. Okay. So I was trying to explain the same thing. So here, when the acceleration is very low, this would be the regime. So it is about 10 power minus 10. So it is here. And so when it is very low, we expect a straight line, which is of slope 0.5. When the acceleration is very high, that is this part, we observe it to be on the x is equal to y line. In between, it is a transition stage. However, we are not interested in this part for galaxy clusters, at least because the accelerations here are very low. What would happen in that part is it would be still on this relation. However, for galaxy clusters, we are not really interested in
okay.
that part.
So there's another last question because I have many more questions, but time won't be accommodated. The last question is from Abhinandan Chakraborty, that what is the physical significance of RR?
Physical significance. So again, so within lambda CDM, it is something that is very important. So we are observing, so there is baryonic mass on one hand, which forms a very low percent of the total mass, let's say about 15% or 20%. On the other hand, we have the dark matter, which is forming the 80%. So what we are telling is, once we know the A bar, that is the baryonic acceleration, we actually know what the the acceleration due to the total mass would be. That is like this small percentage of baryonic mass is actually controlling the dark matter, the profile of dark matter, which would be there in galaxy clusters. Galaxy clusters or galaxies, and this would be significant. Like a small percent will be actually controlling. Like still within lambda CDM, I guess the dark matter profile is the dominating one. So it can be the, I mean, what its profile is might be expected to be different than that of, guided by the baryonic action.
I think that answers the question. If there is no anything question, I have just a short question. Explain me very short. You told that you have taken this cluster sample you shown in the slide. So my question will be that, can we work with any other sample? Is there any physical meaning of choosing these 3 samples only? Do you have any another?
We use these 3 samples because the mass measurements were available.
Okay.
Mass profiles were available. Now I think eROSITA is coming up. We can.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pradyumna, for a very nice talk. You can unshare. You can stop sharing the screen right now if there is no anything. Okay. So our next speaker in this round is Vishwaraj Palit from Jadavpur University. Vishwaraj,
Yes.
you can go ahead.
Okay. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible. You just go in the presentation. That's right. So it's all.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Vishwaraj Palit, and I'm going to talk about multi-wavelength flux correlation of TeV binary LSI plus 61303. During the talk, I will discuss about gamma ray binaries, then talk about some features about LSI plus 61303. Then I will discuss the aims of my study, followed by the results and some conclusion with outlook. Before diving into the main topic, here is a quick recap of what are binary star systems. When two stars revolve around each other about their center of mass, it is called a binary star system. As you can see in the video, it's shown their motion is governed by Kepler's law. Few notable examples include Sirius and Cygnus X1. Even our Earth and Sun is a binary system. Similarly, there exists a special class of binaries called gamma ray binaries. As their name suggests, these are primarily emitting in the high energy and very high energy range. Also, they show a peak above 1 MeV. 1 MeV corresponds to the gamma energy. Such systems comprise of a massive BE star, which is sitting at the foci, and a compact object which is revolving around the BE star. Now, the nature of the compact object is a topic of research. It may be a neutron star or a black hole. Until the 21st century, these objects were hidden from us because we did not have a special class of telescopes called IACTs. IACT stands for Imaging Array of Cherenkov Telescopes. These are ground-based telescopes, as you can see in the figure, and they are only in a few countries right now. The top three are the big players like the MAGIC telescope in La Palma, Veritas in Arizona, and HESS in Namibia. India is one of the few countries to have this technology, like the TACTIC telescope in Rajasthan and Hagar in Ladakh. Now, there are two models which are proposed for gamma emission. The first one is the pulsar wind model. In this model, if the gamma ray binary consists of a pulsar, then that pulsar undergoes spin down and produces a relativistic wind around itself called the pulsar wind. That wind is mainly dominated by electrons and positrons. Thus, these particles moving at relativistic speeds produce synchrotron radiation, which we observe as X-ray. Now, when this pulsar wind interacts with a stellar wind or a BE disk, it reaches a termination shock region. In this termination shock region, it is believed that these particles undergo diffusive shock acceleration, and via inverse Compton process, they upscatter UV photons to gamma photons. This is how we obtain gamma energy. Now, the competing model which exists is the microquasar model, which is rather recently proposed. These are versions of scaled down versions of AGN or active galactic nuclei. Here, a neutron star or a black hole accretes matter from the companion star and forms an accretion disk. As gravitational energy is converted into X-ray in this accretion disk, some of the gravitational energy is channeled to form collimated ejecta particles at relativistic speeds called relativistic jets. It is believed that these jets, when they interact with the stellar wind, produce gamma rays. It is important to study gamma ray binaries because they help us locate the position of cosmic accelerators in the sky. Also, understanding the mechanism of emission will help us unify other systems which also emit in gamma rays. Finally, they may host some unknown particles which do not fit into the standard model, like a dark matter particle. Coming to LSI, that is the binary I have worked with. LSI radiates from radio to up to 300 TeV energy range. So the energy emission range is very high. And it was discovered in 2006 by MAGIC telescope. This is a picture posted by NASA where you can see LSI is located here in the high energy region, the red yellow portion. The compact object of LSI is a topic of huge research right now. It has a orbital period of 26.5 days and eccentricity, which is highly eccentric actually, it is 0.54. In this projected view of its orbit, 0.230 is the periastron passage, that is the nearest approach condition. And this is the farthest position called the apastron at 0.730. Some features of LSI include periodic VHE emissions or TeV range emissions. Veritas in 2006 confirmed that it undergoes VHE emission in the phase 0.5 to 0.7. In 3 different orbits, you can see every time at the same phase, there was TeV flaring episodes. Also, it undergoes something that is very recent and unique, is called superorbital variability. What happens is that the TeV flux undergoes high flux state and low flux state across a 4.5-year period, which is equal to 1667 days. This light curve fits well to a sine plot, so this confirms some periodicity is present. Now, in 2014, some historic flares were observed in LSI. Why historic? Because they were 30% of the Crab nebula flux, which is the highest ever observed from a gamma ray source. So this pushes the reason why more research should be done into gamma ray binaries. Aims of my current research include using maximum archival data to improve the statistics. With that, I will conduct a correlation phase resolved study and propose a model which will comply with the observations. Some materials and methods. So first step is data collection. I have collected data, the high energy data, which is 1 to 300 GeV. I have collected this data from Fermi LAT Photon Query, which is an online utility. Then the very high energy data, which is TeV data, was collected from previous publications as well as high level FITS files provided by MAGIC website. Then I have combined the MAGIC and Veritas data to increase the number of data. The X-ray data was obtained from the telescope Swift XRT, which is via this online utility called Build Swift XRT by University of Leicester. Then I have divided the data into soft KeV and hard KeV. These are the energy ranges. During data preparation, I have considered data from 2007 to 2014. These are the numbers across 3 different energy ranges. Also, these data are above 3 sigma confidence level, that is above 99% confidence level. The KeV data was averaged from 6 hourly to 24 hourly data to match the other 2 energy ranges actually. And also the statistical errors, all the errors that I have considered are all statistical, not instrumental. Any time that was fractional was rounded off to the nearest integer, and also the time format I have used is modified Julian-Day or MJD. The significance level I have set for my statistics is 5%. In this table, you can see all the simultaneous data for carrying out the correlation. These are the 3 energy ranges and for the 7-year period and only 2014. The 2 techniques that I have employed is light curve analysis to detect variability and Pearson's correlation to detect any interlink between independent quantities. This is the first result for the 7 years of data. As you can see in the TeV and KeV, KeV means X-ray, TeV means very high energy. This is the scatter plot and there is very mild correlation or no correlation, but the fit is good, but the R value is not that good. In X-ray, in very high energy and GeV data, there is a mild negative correlation. This is the GeV and KeV correlation. This is a much better statistics because the number of data was high and there is absolutely no correlation. This is the light curve for 6-year period from 2008 to 2014. As you can see, the TeV data is not at all dense, whereas GeV data is quite dense. And X-ray data is dense, but only in parts. Considering these factors, as well as the factor that TeV flaring was highest in 2014, I have considered only the 2014 data for the following results. This is the result for 2014 season. And the first light curve here is the X-ray versus very high energy. As you can see, when TeV flares were high, X-ray is also high. When this is low, this is also low. And the highest flaring activity occurred around this 0.7, or as I previously mentioned, before apastron. Now, since there is some similarity be interlinked between these two radiation, but the same cannot be said for TeV versus GeV, because sometimes they match, sometimes they don't. So it is erratic. This is the correlation for 2014 season, but using combined data of MAGIC and Veritas. Here there is very good correlation, in fact very high correlation between KeV and TeV flux. Also hard X-ray has better correlation than soft X-ray. Nevertheless, all these three have p-value which is higher than my set 5% value. This is the TeV-GeV scatter, and as previously seen, this has a negative correlation, so they don't match. And also GeV-KeV correlation is shown, but the fit is not at all good. To conclude, with 7 years of data, I have found no correlation in TeV and GeV. For TeV-KeV, there was extremely low correlation, as good as no correlation actually. With 2014 data, TeV-GeV non-correlation is confirmed, but there was a significant correlation in TeV-KeV. Both these claims are supported by 3 sigma confidence level, but anyways, there were high uncertainties, so nothing should be concluded from them. Also, TeV flaring episodes were only detected before apastron, but this does not mean periastron phase has no emission, because there is the dense BE disk which may be hindering the emissions. Since I have found a small hint of correlation between X-ray and TeV, this may suggest that the emissions are produced by a single particle population. Large uncertainties anyways make it difficult to draw further conclusions.
Bishra, just your time is up. Just you can quickly summarize up. I just give you a word.
Okay,
Go
and the TeV data is also not dense. And in the coming days, I intend to conduct a phase resolve study as well as fit a relevant model. Some future outlook remain like correlating optical and H-alpha line and producing high resolution radio images, and these will help answer whether it's a pulsar binary or a black hole. I would like to thank my supervisor and presidency for providing me the opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishraj, for this wonderful talk. I can see there is 3 questions in the chat box. So I go one by one. Mohammad Zakir Ali asks you, why is the pulsar wind electron-positron dominated only?
Okay, so there is a prevailing idea. There are actually 2 models, leptonic model and hadronic model. In the leptonic model is highly accepted because there are other research which show that it should be dominated by leptons or electrons positrons, like some spectral studies show that. The hadronic model consists of protons and neutrons, but they require much higher velocities to produce gamma rays, so that is less accepted. This is why it's considered dominated by positrons.
Okay, so the next question is from Partha Sarathi. Have the depth as hypothesized in the microquasar model been observed, or more generally, is there any observational support for microquasar model?
Yes, there is. Firstly, recently some radio images have been produced which show a jet-like structure, but only in one direction. Microquasars generally have jet-like structures in 2 directions, but still there are other hints, like there is a condition called precession of jet that is also seen from the radio images. This also proves. Also, as you can see, the emission is concentrated in the apastron region, which is far away from the BE disk. So when can that happen? When the matter tries to eject out far away from the star. So this also points towards a microquasar model. But there are some competing ideas also.
Okay, so there is another question from Tista Mukherjee. Can we expect any other messengers being emitted from this system other than gamma ray photons?
Any other messenger? Well, the other messenger is gravitational waves, but until and unless something collides, the waves have very small amplitude. So right now, I don't think so that we have the technology to measure gravitational waves only for orbiting stars. They need to collide to create a huge uh, explosion. Okay.
So there is last question from Sulagno. How will you fit the model you are talking about? I mean, can you please put some light into the coordinates you will consider along with the
Okay.
parameters?
Yes, so as I mentioned previously, I will do a phase result study. I will separate the phases where there is link between two types of radiation and where there is no link. Then I will create a statistics as to which phases have better correlation and which phases don't. I will take this into account and build a model which will also mimic this nature actually. All right.
Okay, so now once again thanking you. If there is so the Sulagno writes okay. So thank you once again, Vishwarat,
Okay.
for this nice stuff. We can go to the move to the next speaker. So our next speaker is Srinikita Kashi Bhagwati from Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Srinikita, you can share your screen and go ahead.
Hello, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's absolutely feasible. You can go ahead.
Okay. So, good afternoon to one and all present here. My name is Srinikita Bhagwati and I'm from IIT Hyderabad. Today I will be presenting my work on Bayesian analysis of the time dependence of the gamma modulation amplitude that I have done under the guidance of Professor Shantanu Desai. So, before I Before I begin with the presentation, I'd first like to give you an outline of everything that it entails. Firstly, I'll begin with a brief introduction to annual modulation and the Dharma experiment itself. Secondly, I look at the model comparison techniques that I've used for this analysis. Thirdly, we'll see what data sets and what functions we've used to determine the time dependence of the said modulation amplitude and the data and the two analyses we do as a part of it, and end the presentation with conclusion and questions. So, for a long time now, we've known that only 5% of the universe is made up of ordinary atomic matter. 23% of the remaining universe is made up of dark matter, whose composition we don't know of yet. Identifying the nature of this matter has become a very very profound problem in today's research. So one of the very well-motivated candidates for dark matter is this weakly interacting massive particle, also abbreviated as WIMPs. As the name suggests, it undergoes weak interactions with and gravity and does not have strong or electromagnetic interactions. Now, these dark matter particles are distributed throughout the Milky Way. Because of the motion of the galactic disk, even though the WIMPs may be non-rotating, there's an effective wind of these WIMP particles that is constantly passing through the Earth, as shown in this picture. Since the proposal of such particles, there have been many experiments attempting to detect them. Around 30 years ago, it was suggested that we can detect these particles by observing the nuclear recoil caused by these particles when they weakly interact with the detectors, like the nuclei in the detectors. These are called direct detection experiments, and they measure the energy deposited by the WIMPs when they interact with the nuclei when they're passing through Earth. Now, apart from the effective wind generated with these particles, there's also the relative velocity of the Earth with respect to the Sun. And because of this relative velocity of the Earth and thus the detectors, the count rate observed in these detectors changes throughout the years, and this dependence would be sinusoidal. Detecting this annual modulation of the count rate would offer powerful proof for WIMPs and the dark matter, and it is this annual modulation that occurs because of the relative velocity of the Earth with respect to the Sun. It's this annual modulation that we're going to discuss throughout the presentation. Now, like I mentioned before, the count rate follows the sinusoidal relationship. The theoretically expected expression is given here. Since the proposal of direct detection experiments, many groups and experiments have been conducted trying to observe this modulation amplitude. But so far, only one group has claimed to do so, and that is the DAMA group. This Italian dark matter experiment it's been running for over 20 years and over 3 phases. And the observed modulation has the correct phase and the amplitude according to the theoretical predictions that we have. Since a lot of other experiments have failed to observe any modulation amplitude in their experiments, it's very important that we properly scrutinize and understand this recoil rate expression and understand the modulation amplitude term itself. The modulation amplitude term is the one that we're pointing to with the red arrow, and this is understanding this properly is important to differentiate between the signal and the background. So in this particular work, we're focusing our attention to determine if there's any time dependence in this particular term, which is the modulation amplitude. We must note that there has been a paper by K18, referred here, that had tackled a similar problem, where they actually found that their time-dependent models are preferred over their time-independent models by a significance of approximately 2.5 sigma with the data available back then. But since DAMA group has released data for data even in 2018, with the new releases and combined with the previous releases, we put them all together to re-examine if there is any time dependence for the modulation amplitude. So before we get to the analysis, let's take a quick look at what exactly we do. The Bayes factor is taken as a ratio of the Bayesian evidence for the model 2 and the model 1. If the Bayes factor is less than 1, then that indicates that model 1 is favored, as there is negative support for model 2. If the Bayes factor is greater than 10, there is moderate evidence, and if it's much greater than 100, then it's said to provide decisive evidence that model 2 is favored. We do all our analysis using Nestle, which is a Python package that is based on nested sampling algorithm that we use to calculate Bayesian evidence. Now, we get to the brunt of the work. So to review, the objective of our analysis is to find the time dependence of this one SM term, which is the modulation amplitude term in the annual modulation signal. So to do so, we use 3 functions, out of which one is a time-independent constant function given here. And the other 2 are time-varying functions. One is a linearly time-varying function, and the other is an exponentially time-varying function, both for the modulation amplitude term. We also perform 2 different analyses to determine the time dependence. One is by using the single hit residual rate data from the DAMA experiment, and the other is by using the mean per cycle modulation amplitude data. Now, we start with analysis 1, which is the single hit residual rate data. Now for this data corresponds to the SM cos omega t minus t naught term that we've seen earlier in the recoil rate. The data is taken from DAMA NAI, DAMA Libra phase 1 and phase 2, which are the 3 phases of the DAMA experiment. The data is taken from these plots, some like more plots, but some of the plots are shown here as they are taken from the 2018 paper release. We also need to give priors to the code. So the uniform, we've taken uniform priors in these ranges for the terms. The terms are come from these functions. The priors are chosen such that the minimum based on the minimum and maximum values of the residual rate data. And as for omega, the maximum period for which we can detect potential modulation is half the total duration of the set. So the value, the omega corresponding to that period is taken as the minimum value of omega. And the maximum value of omega corresponds to the median difference between two time data points. So that's for the setting up of the code. And now the results. So we've performed, as you can see, we've performed chi-square by degree of freedom tests, goodness of fit tests, and all the values are very close to 1. The constant time independent model is taken as the null hypothesis, and the linearly varying and the exponentially time varying models are taken with respect to that. So the base factors of the linear and exponential model are as given here. As you can see, all the base factors are very, very small, much less than 1. So that points to the fact that there is no time dependence of the modulation amplitude term when we take the single hit residual rates of residual rate data from the DAMA experiment. This you can also see this in these plots where we've plotted the best fit parameter values against the data given by the experiment group. The constant linear and exponential things are all very similar. So it further sums up our conclusion that there is there is no evidence for any time dependence. Now we also perform analysis on the mean per cycle modulation amplitude. Here we take the data. Here the data corresponds to just the term SM, and this term comes from this data comes from this plot that's given in the 2018 paper from the DAMA group. The priors are taken in a similar manner to the priors that have how the priors have been taken in the previous analysis. And the functions, as you can see, are again the constant linear and exponential functions that have been taken before. Once again, we look at the results. The chi-square by degree of freedom values are all very close to 1. Once again, the constant time-independent model is taken as the null hypothesis, and the base factors for the linear and exponential time-dependent models are given here. As you can see, the base factor estimates are all either less than 1 or very close to 1. So once again, we can say that there is no strong evidence for time dependence via the linear or the exponential models, given even the mean per cycle modulation amplitudes. Once again, we plot the best fit values against the data given by DAMA. And as you can see, the constant time independent model corresponds to red, linear to blue, and exponential to black. So yeah, that's it. To conclude, we have briefly discussed the DAMA experiment and direct detection experiments and their significance. We've discussed the techniques that we've included in this work, we've used to do this work. Then we've seen that doing both the analysis using the single hit residual rate data and the mean per cycle modulation amplitude data, both those analysis shows that there is no time dependence in the modulation amplitude term. If you want more details about this, please see this paper. I also want to take this moment to thank the Precision Symposium for letting me present here. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Sumita, for the very nice talk. So I can see there is one question in the chat box from Mohammad Zakir Ali. He has actually 2 questions. Can you briefly describe the modulation amplitude's physical meaning, significance, I might have missed it.
Okay, so as you can see here, the Earth has a relative velocity with respect to the Sun. So the Sun's moving through the Milky Way. And because of the movement of the galactic disk itself, there is an effective wind generated because of these dark matter particles that is moving towards the Sun. But because there's a further movement between the Earth and the Sun, the count rates or the particles detected by the detectors that are placed deep underground Earth also exhibit different values at different times of the year. So when they're moving in one direction with respect to the Sun, they show. So they're supposed to peak in June. So when they're moving in the same direction as the Sun, they peak. When they're moving in the other direction, the count rate becomes less. And this modulation is what we're referring to as the annual modulation. Was that clear?
I think it is a bit clear, maybe. Yeah, there is another question by him only. Any specific reasons for using Nestle? Can we use any other program?
Yeah, you can. We use Nestle because it's a very convenient file. Like it's designed to calculate Bayesian evidence, but you can use any other.
Since there is no any other questions, I have personally two questions to you. In the initiatory slide, you showed that there is my question would be this: what would the sensitivity of the direct detection experiments to detect the energy deposited by winds, the weakly interact mass particles? What should be the sensitivity of this direct detection experiment to detect the energy deposited by this wave?
I mean, I probably have to look it up, but if you want the answer, it's there. In the slide that I'm sharing right now, I've linked a paper there, right? In this one, as well as the figure in the previous thing, both those have extensively covered the sensitivity, the detectors part of the experiment. So you can look them up there. I personally don't know.
So thank you. There is I will ask just a query. You may ask. I am just asking as a query.
Yeah.
That you have considered. I've shown that you have considered three models: constant, linear, and exponential. So my question: we could have incorporated any other models. Then we can look for that. Is there any time dependence or not? That only three models. Can we increase it, or any other model we can incorporate in your analysis?
So the reason we've considered we consider the constant model because it's the time independent model. You expect the modulation amplitude term to be constant. The linear and the exponential functions, we've considered them because the previous paper, right, Kelso 18, the one I've referenced here, they've considered linear, exponential, and a couple more models. And these are the models that have shown the greatest significance for time dependence. And apart from that, there are also, if you expect them to be time difference, these are the most simple models that could represent that there's time, like it's either decreasing or increasing through time.
Okay. So thank you once again for the very nice talk. So if there is no more questions, we can again thank the speaker and we can move to the next speaker. Our next speaker. So our next speaker is Akash Kumar Shah from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Akash, you can. I can hear you, but since that problem of sound is still exists with me, anyone else can say. Shomadip, can you hear Akash?
Yeah, it is faint, but maybe it is audible. He may start.
It is audible, but it's quite faint. I think you can go ahead with it. Just share.
It's still faint, right?
It's still faint, but you can go ahead. If problem exists, we can then look into it. That you.
Yeah, I can actually try with the mobile device.
You can then. I think we can wait 2-3 minutes. We can accommodate that time.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's right. Right now,
It is clear.
Yeah. So I am using my mobile to just speak, and then I have to share from my laptop. Yeah, it's weird.
Okay. Take time, no problem.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to share my screen. You can see my screen, right?
Yeah, let's see it. Your
And
screen
let me
just,
try to make it bigger.
yeah, it's absolutely right. You can go ahead.
Yeah, and the screen is moving, right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let me start. So, good afternoon, everyone. So today I'll be talking about a search for dark matter using sub-PeV gamma rays observed by TBTS gamma. And this is a work done in collaboration with Dr. Taraknath Maiti, Abhishek Dubey, and Dr. Ranjan Lal. And this is the archive number of our paper. So if you're interested, you can check it out. Now let's get started. So first of all, let's look at the total energy density of the universe in the present day. And as we can see that the energy density is dominated by either dark energy or dark matter. Now, regarding this dark matter, this 26.6% dark matter, we actually know very little. So the question remains, how can we detect dark matter? Now, there are various kinds of techniques that are being used in today's world to detect dark matter. And one of the most exciting ones is something known as the India detection. So what is India detection? So let's say I have a dark matter particle chi, and these dark matter particles can annihilate each other and give me two standard particles. Now, what I will try to do in my experiment is that I will try to detect these standard particles, and that will actually give me information about the dark matter particle from which this is coming from. Now, here I've illustrated the example for a dark matter annihilation, but the similar situation can occur for dark matter decay. And this whole discussion of India detection is actually very important for what I'm going to discuss next. Now, let's jump to the main experiment that our paper is based on, and that is the Tibet-ACE gamma experiment. Now, this Tibet-ACE gamma experiment is actually situated in Yangbajing in Tibet, China, and this is basically a cosmic ray air shower detector. Now, very recently, this detector has actually published their result, and the result can be summarized in these two plots. Now, here in the x-axis, we have the photon energy in TeV, and in the y-axis, we have the flux. And these red dots are basically the data points that are detected by this Tibet-ACE gamma experiment. You can also see these black, solid, and dotted lines. So these are various astrophysical background models for this diffuse gamma ray. And also you can see these blue boxes, which are basically the detection from an earlier experiment that was this Argo YPJ. Now these two plots are basically similar, but the only difference here is that the range of galactic longitude. Now, why is this so important? So first of all, this is very important because this is the first time that we have ever detected this sub-PeV diffuse gamma rays. So previously we had some upper bound. So here you can see by these blue triangles, experiments like Casamia has put an upper bound, but this is the first time we have actually detected these galactic sub-PeV diffuse gamma rays. So that's why it's very important discovery. Now the first question that may arise is, what are diffuse gamma rays? We know about gamma rays, but what are diffuse gamma rays? So let's say you have a detector and there are some photons coming into your detector. Now there can be two scenarios. First, this photon can come from a point source, and sometimes what happens is that these photons are not coming from any point source. And this latter scenario is something known as these diffuse gamma rays. And these are the gamma rays that are being detected by this Tibet-ACE gamma experiment. Now, this is the map of the whole sky in three different energy beams as seen by this Tibet-ACE gamma experiment. And the first thing to notice here is that this gray shaded region are the region of the sky that this Tibet-ACE gamma experiment cannot see. So this depends on the location of the experiment. Also, there is this dark, the solid line, black solid line. So this is basically the galactic plane. Now, if you look closely, then you notice is that there are two different kinds of points. So first of all, there are these red points, which are basically the gamma ray that are coming from known sources. And then you can also see these blue dots, which are basically gamma rays that are not coming from known sources. So these are basically the diffuse gamma rays. And these are the gamma rays that we are interested in. Now, the question here is that how are these gamma rays produced in the first place? There are various kinds of production mechanisms that can be there. And the three most important ones are this pion decay, Bremsstrahlung, and inverse Compton. So what happens in pion decay? So whenever cosmic rays interact with the interstellar medium in our galaxy, what happens is that the protons in the cosmic ray can interact with the protons in the ISM, and that can give rise to this neutral pion, and that can decay down to these gammas. In case of Bremsstrahlung, we can have a scenario where electrons are interacting with these protons and giving rise to these gamma rays. And last but not the least, we can have a scenario where low energy photons can interact with electron, and that can give rise to these gamma rays via this inverse Compton. Now, having looked at the production mechanism, let us look at the propagation. So here in this very small cartoon, what we can see here is that the cosmic rays are coming in, interacting with the interstellar gas via the process that I've just discussed. And after these diffuse gamma rays are produced, they can actually hit the atmosphere and they can produce some air shower, and then they will be detected by some detector. Now, sometimes what happens is that during the propagation, these diffuse gamma rays can interact with the CMB photon, and that can give rise to this E plus E minus. And that actually attenuates the total amount of diffuse gamma ray that is being received in our Earth. Now, having done all of that, finally the diffuse gamma ray comes to the atmosphere and it interacts with the nucleus in the atmosphere, and it creates E plus E minus, and that creates subsequent air shower. Now, this whole air shower is actually a component of the whole air shower that is being detected by this TVTS experiment. Now, an interesting fact here is that cosmic ray itself can interact with the nucleus in the atmosphere, and that can also create this air shower. And this should be detected by the TVTS gamma. So now the question is, how do you discriminate between an air shower created by a cosmic ray and an air shower created by these diffuse gamma rays? Well, the discrimination is actually pretty simple. So what is done is that below the TVTS gamma experiment, below the ground, there are various muon detectors. So in the right, what you can see is that in case of a gamma ray induced air shower, the amount of muon is very less. So these blue lines are basically the muons that are detected underground. And in case of a proton induced or cosmic ray induced air shower, the number of these muon events are much larger. So just by applying a simple muon cut, we can actually discriminate between an air shower that is being produced by cosmic ray and an air shower that is being produced by this diffuse gamma ray. Now, we have just discussed about the mechanism of the production of this diffuse gamma ray and also how these gamma rays are being detected by TVTS gamma experiment. And now you may wonder how dark matter is coming into the picture. Now we know for a fact that dark matter is there in our galaxy, and also in the region of interest of this TVTS gamma experiment, the density of dark matter is actually pretty high. So what can happen is that a dark matter can decay down into several final state particles, and those particles can decay down to this pi zero, and that can even create these gammas. So finally, after all this reaction, we can have a gamma signal, which should be detected by your TVTS gamma experiment. Now, an important fact here is that looking back at the result of this TVTS gamma, so you may want to look for some excess in the data, because as you can see that not all data are following the background. Now, the problem here is that if you want to look closely to this picture, this translates to the picture in the right, where this pink region is basically the best fit astrophysical background. So basically, whatever you are seeing here as this bold line is not actually a line, but actually a region. So there is significant uncertainty in the astrophysical background model. Now, also there is uncertainty in the data itself. So with these kinds of uncertainty at this moment, we cannot say that there is an excess. So there is no way to claim an excess in this TVTS conversion. So what is our claim? So our claim is that the photons that are coming out of this dark matter decay plus the galactic CR induced diffuse gamma ray can give rise to the total flux that is being observed in the TVT. Now, regarding this astrophysical diffuse gamma ray, there are various kinds of models, but the three most important ones are the space-dependent cosmic ray, space-independent cosmic ray, and heavy gamma ray. And I'll not go into the details of these models, but if you're interested, you can check out these papers. Try to calculate the gamma ray flux that is coming out of from this dark matter decay. So this is the relation that we should use for this kind of scenario. And here in the left, we have the flux of gamma ray coming out of this dark matter decay. The m chi is the dark matter mass. The tau is basically the dark matter lifetime. This DND is basically the emission spectrum of this photon from any of the dark matter decay channels. This rho chi is the density of dark matter in the region of interest. Now, for our convenience, we have taken the NFW profile. And last but not least, we have this exponential as tau factor, which is basically the attenuation factor, because these diffuse gamma rays are interacting with low energy photons. So that's why there is an attenuation factor. So this was a brief overview of how to calculate the gamma ray flux coming out of dark matter decay. And beforehand, we know the astrophysical background. So with these two information, we can come to our final result. So here in the x-axis, we have the mass of the dark matter particle, and in the y-axis, we have the lifetime of the dark matter particle. And this is done for the channel chi to BB bar. So dark matter is decaying to BB bar. Now here what you can see is that depending on the background model, we can have different kinds of constants. And the basic idea of this constant plot is that anything that is shaded is actually ruled out. So let's say you'll say that there is a dark matter particle of 10 to the 7 GeV and its lifetime is 10 to the 20. It cannot be, because it's simply ruled out by this experiment. Now you can also see that there is a violet colored, this dotted curve, and this is basically the combined previous limits that had been set by experiments like Fermi at IceCube. And what we can see is that at a significant amount of this parameter space, our limit is actually the strongest one. So just by using 3 data points created by this TVTS gamma measurement, we can actually put the strongest constraints on the lifetime of dark matter. Now we have repeated this case for various other standard model final states, and in most of the cases, our limits are actually stronger than any of the previous limits there. So to conclude, this TVTS gamma measurement of this galactic high energy diffuse gamma ray has opened a new chapter in the multi-messenger astrophysics. Now, this diffuse gamma ray can actually be an excellent probe for dark matter detection in future. And in this work, we are trying to derive a very conservative limit on the dark matter lifetime from this measurement. And in various scenarios, our limit is the strongest one. So we hope that in future, there will be an improvement in both the theoretical understanding of the background, and also we'll have more data. So as a result of which we'll be able to either detect dark matter signal or put sharper constraints on the properties. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Akash, for this wonderful talk. So there I can see that there's two questions, one from Debabrata Buho, that why physically is the muon ratio less in the gamma ray air shower?
Yes. So basically, let me go back. Yes, so basically what happens in cosmic ray air showers is there are various kinds of these pions and all these hadrons are produced. And these hadrons can actually like significantly produce these muons. But in case of primary this diffuse gamma ray, there can be some occasional gamma p interaction, but the amount of muon is actually very less. So that's why like hadrons are very much effective in producing this kind of high energy muons. So that's why there is a less amount of muons.
Okay. So there is another question in the chat from Shinjon Majumdar. In indirect detection process, you look at the SM particle, the sand model particle. But in the case that those particles can be produced by several channels, how do you know that the initial dark matter particles are? Can it be known at all in this process?
Yeah, so basically what is done here is that, so basically you can do two things, right? So you can just look at for a signal that should be a spike. If you're detecting, let's say, gamma signal, then it should be a spike. But here what is happening is there is a spectra, right? So that's why we are actually using this chi2 BB bar, because there's not one data point that you are considering here. There are three data points. So what is happening here, this BB bar can decay down to its photons, and that can in principle be contributing to this signal. So right now, wherever we are standing, we can only constrain the amount of dark matter that is there. So as you can see that we can constrain the parameter space, but we cannot for sure say that dark matter is decaying and giving us this signal, because there is no enough data and there are various kinds of uncertainties. So I think from this standpoint, this indirect detection is not that efficient, but it's still very useful, because in future we don't know if there are less uncertainties, then maybe there is a signal that is coming from dark matter.
Okay, thank you. If there is no more questions, we can thank the speaker again and move to the next. Thank you, Akash.
Yeah.
So the last speaker in this symposium is Poulomi Shaduka from Presidency University. Poulomi, you can share your screen.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Poulomi.
Okay.
Just go in the slideshow. Okay.
So hello everyone, I am Poulomi Shadukan from Presidency University. Today I will discuss about peering through the cosmic dawn using artificial intelligence. This is a short outline for my talk. My talk is divided into three basic parts. First, I will go for a background of 21 centimeter signal and how we parameterize our global signal. And then I will go for a brief introduction to the artificial neural network, followed by my own simulations, results, and future plans. Now, the motivation for the project comes from the fact that the 21 centimeter line of neutral hydrogen is a very promising probe for the evolution of the neutral intergalactic medium from cosmic dark ages to cosmic dawn and epoch of reionization. The interaction between the CMB temperature, gas kinetic temperature, and the spin temperature along with radiative transfers leads to a very inexpensive 21 centimeter signal evolving over a redshift range. So here we will develop a numerical tool based on artificial intelligence for the parameter extraction of this global 21 centimeter signal. Now this picture shows the evolution of this universe from very fast instant from Big Bang to our present day universe. Our understanding of the first billion years after Big Bang is not very deep. My basic interest is to focus on the period where first galaxies form and the universe is ionized by their radiation. My current focus is about the prospect of using 21 centimeter line to probe the cosmic dawn and epoch of reionization. So now what is this 21 centimeter signal?
In the ground state of neutral hydrogen, when electron spins drift from being aligned to being anti-aligned with the proton spins, energy must be lost from the atoms. This results an emission of photon corresponding to the wavelength of 21 centimeter. This is known as the famous 21 centimeter line of neutral hydrogen. Now the quantity we actually measure is the differential brightness temperature measured relative to the CMB temperature, and that is redshifted to the observer. This is a mathematical form of differential brightness temperature, where Xi denotes the neutral fraction of hydrogen, omega B and omega M0 are the density parameter for baryonic matter and total matter respectively, and Ts is the spin temperature. So we can see the differential brightness temperature essentially depends on three factors: density, neutral fraction, and the spin temperature. Here's the profile we have generated for 21 centimeter brightness temperature. Now the spin temperature essentially quantifies the relative population of two hyperfine spin states of ground state of neutral hydrogen. There are actually three processes that determines spin temperature: absorption and stimulated emission of CMB photons, collisions with other hydrogen atoms, as well as electrons and protons also. Now, also there are scattering of Lyman alpha photons through excitation and de-excitation. The spin temperature is defined like this, where Xc is the collisional coupling term, X alpha is the Lyman alpha coupling term. Now, we parameterize our global 21 centimeter signal using 10H parameterization model, which uses a set of 10H functions. Here we have modeled Lyman alpha background, ionization fraction, and IgM temperature as simple 10H functions. Here JREF, XREF, and TREF are the corresponding step heights. JZ0, XZ0, and TZ0 are the corresponding pivot rate, and JDZ, XDZ, and TDZ are the corresponding redshift ranges. We have fixed two parameters, XREF to 1 and TREF to 1000 Kelvin. So here we have 7 free parameters, typical values, inferred values of these parameters. So by varying each of these parameters by minus 50% to plus 50% of the typical mean value, we can construct our training sets, and the range explored here are sufficient to represent a wide range of shapes of global 21 centimeter signal. Now coming to the second part, here you can see the basic architecture of artificial neural network. The basic building blocks of artificial neural network are neurons. You can see there are three layers here: input layer, hidden layer, and output layer. Each neuron in the input layer is connected to each neuron in the hidden layer. The input to each neuron in the hidden layer is a linear combination of the neurons in the input layer with their corresponding weights and biases, and that's what's called AJ, and it is called the activation, and this is again transformed using a nonlinear activation function H, and that's what we call ZJ, and these are the corresponding outputs in the hidden layer, and these are again linearly combined to give the inputs of each neuron in the output layer in the similar manner. Now we have defined the error function, a cost function here. The parameter in question, that is the corresponding weights and biases, are determined by minimizing the sum of squares error function. In the backpropagation algorithm, the error is backpropagated in such a way so as to adjust weights that the error function is minimized. The slope of the error function is calculated so that the weights can be adjusted accordingly. This will be clear in a moment if we follow an example problem, that is the flower plot. Here we can see there is a flower for which the length and width are given, and also the color of the flower are given. These are either red or blue. But here is a flower for which we know the length and width, but we don't know its color, and our task is to find the color of mystery flower using artificial intelligence. This is the visual representation of the network for this problem. Length is weighted by a factor W1, width is weighted by factor W2, and B is the best term, and that's we call Z, and everything is fed into sigmoid, and sigmoid is a function whose value always lies between 0 and 1. and that's we call Fret, and the difference between Fret and target we call gift, and we define our error function as cost equal to difference square. Now, using this tree diagram, we have to find out how cost changes for very small changes in W1, W2, and D. So first looking into W1, the partial derivative of cost with respect to diff gives 2 into diff. Partial derivative of diff with respect to freight gives 1. Partial derivative of freight with respect to z gives sigmoid and z. There is a linear combination of 3 multiplicative terms. If we assume as M1, M2, and M3, first look at M1. The partial derivative of z with respect to M1 gives 1, and the partial derivative of M1 with respect to W1 gives length. So here we have to multiply all written in this red brackets to find how cost changes for a very tiny change in W1. In the same method, we can also do the same for W2 and B as well. Now, minimizing the error, we can have our results that our mystery flower was red. Now coming back to our own problem, here we have 5 parameters to predict. We have fixed x, z0 and x. These get fixed only for simplicity. Here we have used 3 hidden layers with 256, 128 and 64 neurons respectively. Here we have choose to work with a bandwidth of 20 to 160 megahertz frequency with 1024 frequency channels. Here we have used scikit-learn package to build simple neural network. So we have constructed 4850 samples for the training purpose and also 150 samples for testing our network. So here is my results. You can see the true values versus the predicted value of all of the 5 parameters from the network. We have predicted all of the 5 parameters simultaneously. So we have 150 sets of predictions for all of these 5 parameters. So if our predictions matches exactly with our true values, it will be a straight line with a slope 1. So you can see this is indicated by these red lines, and we can also see that our predictions matches pretty well with the true values. Here we have also calculated the root mean square errors for all of these 5 parameters. Here are the value listed. Now our ongoing work is to construct check the robustness of our network. So to doing this, I have constructed a prediction set that is completely unknown to the network. I have added an instrumental thermal noise added to our signal to make this prediction set. So now this time you can see there are the RMSE values are quite high with respect to the previous ones. That signifies that our prediction is not so much good. This plot also shows the same thing. So our next target is to build our network in such a way that it can predict well for any of such unknown data sets. Also, we can add a model of galactic foreground. Also, we can add an instrumental effect model to build a rich training set to build our network robust. And here is the summary. Here we have discussed the methods and results we obtained using artificial neural network for the parameter extraction of 21 centimeter signal from Carnage parameterization model. And we can also do the same process using all of the 7 parameters at a time. And finally, when we'll have a well-trained network, we can also check our algorithm using real-life observational data sets. Here are my references, check, and I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Kanun Kumar Dutta, for guiding me throughout my project work. And also I am grateful to Mr. Kaustubh Ghoshal from Trinity College, Dublin, for helping me to learn the numerical techniques to build the artificial neural network. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Poulami, for the very nice talk. I can see there is 3 questions in the chat box. I will go one by one. So there's the first question is from Malvika, that why do you use Carnage parameterization?
Yeah, actually the reason why we choose Carnage parameterization model, because it can really mimic the shape of the global signal very well. And also it can be directly related to the physical properties of the IGM intergalactic medium. So to a great extent, that's why we use 10-inch parameterization model.
Okay. So the next question is, how do you choose number of hidden layers in the network and also the number of neurons in each layer?
Okay. Yes. Actually, there is no particular thumb rule actually. The choice of these numbers, that is the choice of the number of layers in the network and the number of neurons in each hidden layer are basically determined by our trial and error method. Firstly, we begin with an initial guess and for each of these numbers, and then vary both of the numbers. Finally, we stop at a time when the root mean square error is least. Then we stick at this point that for this problem, I have these numbers. In my current problem, I use 3 hidden layers, and that's how I choose the hidden layer sizes and dimensions.
Okay. So the last
Hello?
question from Shayan Pal. Hello. The last question from Shayan Pal is a very nice talk. Can you please elaborate that how did you construct the prediction set if samples are unknown to the network?
Yes, actually, here I have generated an instrumental thermal noise using a set of random numbers of normal distribution, which have in 0 and standard deviation 25 millikelvin. And I add this instrumental noise to the signal and makes this prediction set that is unknown to the network. Also, we can do use an perfect model for this instrumental noise, and here we can use a set of sinusoids to mix this to build this instrumental thermal noise model.
Okay, thank you. I have other questions I will ask you later. So thank you for following for the very nice talk. So you can
Okay.
stop sharing your screen. So with this, we end this astrophysics and high energy physics session, and I hand over the microphone to Ishwar to carry forward the session. So over to you, Ishwar.
Okay. I would like to thank all the participants for their amazing talk. And for people who want to continue this discussion can do so on the Slack channel. Also, posters have been uploaded, so interested people can take a look at them. We shall end the session here and meet again at 12:45 for the last session of the undergraduate symposium, which will be on theoretical physics. Thank you.